Harley Davidson, an American icon, has just been torn apart by its own leadership. And if you think this is just about motorcycles, think again. It's about culture, pride, and the soul of American industry. Stick with me till the end because what happened here could affect all of us. The CEO who didn't know bikes. What happens when you hand the keys of America's most iconic motorcycle company to a sneaker salesman? Harley Davidson found out the hard way. In the year 2020, the board placed Johann Zeitz at the head of the company. Zeitz had built his career at Puma, a global sportswear brand better known for shoelaces and running spikes than engines and chrome. At first, Wall Street praised the choice, applauding his reputation as a turnaround specialist. But riders felt something different in their gut. They knew instinctively that a man who had never lived the life of motorcycles would struggle to carry the torch of a brand built on rebellion, noise, and steel. For generations, Harley was not just a company, but a culture. It was stitched into the fabric of American roads, the smell of gasoline and the sound of V-twin engines vibrating through neighborhoods at dawn. To put someone in charge who had no real history with this identity was more than a gamble. It was a provocation. Dealers whispered doubts, riders posted their anger on forums, and longtime loyalists questioned whether the board had lost its sense of direction. When your customers measure authenticity by grease on hands and miles on odometers, a background in sneakers feels like heresy. This uneasy beginning set the stage for decisions that would soon shake Harley's very foundation. Because Zeitz was not just an outsider, he came armed with plans that would prove even more damaging. If you're finding this breakdown eye-opening, hit that like button and drop a comment below. Let us know if Harley's story surprises you. We've dug through the numbers and history so you don't have to. The Rewire and Hardwire disaster. Fancy names, empty results. Harley's survival plan was a death sentence. Soon after stepping in, Zeitz unveiled strategies branded as Rewire and Hardwire. These programs were dressed up in corporate language, wrapped in glossy presentations that looked like they belonged in a Silicon Valley boardroom instead of a motorcycle plant. The pitch was simple: slim down, modernize, and reposition the brand. But the execution meant something else entirely. Beloved models that had introduced generations of new riders to Harley were suddenly gone. The Sportster 883, the Sportster 1200, and the Road King Standard were not just bikes. They were rites of passage, machines that carried young riders into a lifelong brotherhood. Ending their production felt like a betrayal, as if Harley had decided that its own heritage was disposable. Riders compared it to McDonald's axing the Big Mac to chase some upscale, health-conscious image. The essence of what made Harley accessible was being stripped away. Meanwhile, entry prices began to climb. To walk into a dealership meant facing a $12,000 barrier, a figure that turned away younger enthusiasts and working-class families. The promise of rewiring sounded bold on paper, but in practice it alienated the very people who had kept the company alive through thick and thin. Riders mocked the corporate jargon and warned that Harley was turning into a brand managed by consultants instead of bikers. And the results of these flashy but misguided plans soon showed up in the cold clarity of financial numbers. Every great ride starts with the right setup, from tools to protective accessories. Check the full collection to upgrade your gear. The link is in the description. The numbers don't lie. 60% revenue gone. Harley's biggest collapse ever. The statistics told a story too painful to ignore. Between 2022 and 2024, global sales fell by more than 20%. By the final quarter of 2024, the crisis reached its ugliest point. Harley sold 53% fewer motorcycles compared to the same period a year earlier. Entire showrooms turned into graveyards, rows of gleaming machines gathering dust instead of miles. Shipments echoed the freefall. In 2024, Harley moved only 148,862 motorcycles worldwide, a drop of 17% from the previous year. For a company that once symbolized growth and dominance, this was collapse at breakneck speed. Financially, the bloodbath was undeniable. Revenue in the fourth quarter shrank to $420 million, down 47% from the year before. Alongside it came an operating loss of $214 million. By year's end, Harley's total operating income limped to $417 million, nearly half of what it had earned in 2023. Investors responded with fury. From a stock price of $50 in 2023, Harley tumbled to barely $20 by 2025. Shareholders watched more than half their wealth vanish. It was a collapse so sharp it looked less like a business adjustment and more like a catastrophic implosion. But as devastating as the financial wreckage was, the deeper wound came from something less tangible: the destruction of Harley's cultural soul. From rebellion to betrayal. Made in America? Not anymore. For decades, Harley's strength was not just its motorcycles, but the promise stitched into every badge: American steel, American roads, American freedom. Under Zeitz, even that sacred bond fractured. Manufacturing shifted to factories in Thailand, breaking the covenant riders believed unshakable. Loyalists who paid a premium to own made-in-America machines suddenly discovered they were riding imports dressed in familiar logos. The emotional backlash was immediate and severe. Riders felt cheated, not just as consumers, but as custodians of an identity. If you wanted a cheaper bike made overseas, there were already Hondas and Yamahas waiting. Harley had always been the alternative, the symbol of paying more to own something deeply American. Outsourcing burned that trust to ashes. In bars, garages, and motorcycle rallies, the word betrayal echoed louder than any exhaust. The move was not only economic strategy, it was a cultural severing. Even the broader public, not just the diehard community, recognized the symbolism. If Harley could abandon its American roots, what other icons might follow? The betrayal became a warning, a sign of how fragile even the strongest traditions could be under misguided leadership. And yet, as riders mourned the loss of identity, the company was preparing for another disaster, one wrapped in the sleek language of technology and electrification. The storm of the Livewire catastrophe was about to hit. $30,000 for silence. $30,000 for a Harley without a heartbeat. That was the price tag when Harley rolled out the Livewire, its first electric motorcycle, in 2019. The board hyped it as a revolution, a bold step into the future. But riders were left stunned, not in admiration but in disbelief. Harley had built its entire mythology on noise, the roar of V-twin engines shaking the pavement, the thunder that made neighbors glare at 6 o'clock in the morning. To charge nearly $30,000 for silence was more than tone deaf. It was sacrilege. Riders didn't want a glorified blender disguised as a Harley. They wanted the visceral rumble that had been the brand's signature for more than a century. The company's pitch ignored that core truth. Instead, marketing campaigns painted images of sleek, futuristic urban bikers gliding through city streets with nothing but a faint whir under them. For Harley loyalists, it was like watching a cowboy movie where the hero rides a bicycle instead of a horse. The backlash was swift and brutal. Forums filled with mockery. Dealerships reported that customers laughed at the price. Even casual enthusiasts asked how a company known for working-class grit could justify a sticker price higher than the cost of many cars. The Livewire was not seen as innovation. It was seen as a betrayal of identity, and that perception poisoned the launch from the very start. But if the initial shock was bad, what followed was humiliation. Because the bikes didn't just cost too much, they didn't sell at all. Dust collectors on display. Dealers called them furniture, not motorcycles. Within the first full year of release, Harley managed to sell fewer than 1,000 Livewires worldwide. That is not a typo. For a brand used to moving hundreds of thousands of units annually, the electric flagship was a rounding error. In dealerships across America, rows of unsold bikes gathered dust. They weren't test-driven, they weren't financed. They sat like museum pieces that no one wanted to look at twice. The jokes practically wrote themselves. Videos popped up online where dealers themselves mocked the live wire, calling them dust collectors or silent mistakes. For a company whose strength had always been its passionate dealer network, this was catastrophic. When your own sales force laughs at your product, you've already lost the battle. To make matters worse, the company tried slashing prices by more than $7,000 to generate interest. But the price cuts smelled less like strategy and more like desperation. Customers didn't bite. The stigma around the live wire was too strong. Imagine the contrast. A dealership floor where classic Harleys sold themselves, buyers proudly snapping photos before roaring out of the parking lot, while the live wire sat abandoned, its futuristic dashboard glowing like a joke. Dealers complained that their floor space was being wasted. Customers walked around the bikes as if they weren't even there. It wasn't just a failed product. It was a public embarrassment, one that exposed Harley's inability to understand its own base. And yet, instead of cutting its losses, Harley did something even more baffling. The $100 million mistake. Harley didn't just lose money, they torched $100 million. That was the estimated cost of research, development, and marketing that went into the Livewire project. $100 million for a bike that sold fewer than 1,000 units. It was the kind of math that made analysts choke on their coffee. Any other company might have buried the failure quietly, chalking it up to lessons learned, but Harley doubled down. In 2021, the company spun off Livewire as its own brand, as if a new name would erase the disaster. Investors weren't fooled, riders weren't fooled, dealers weren't fooled. It was like rewrapping spoiled food and hoping customers wouldn't notice the smell. By 2024, Livewire revenue fell another 32%, proving that the so-called rebirth was nothing more than lipstick on a very expensive corpse. Meanwhile, the opportunity cost was staggering. The $100 million poured into Livewire could have supported new affordable models, dealer incentives, or genuine innovation that resonated with Harley's DNA. Instead, it became a black hole of wasted resources. The attempt to rebrand Harley as a futuristic electric giant didn't just fail, it actively hurt the company's credibility. To spend that much money and alienate your core base at the same time was a double strike. The Livewire wasn't a revolution, it was an anchor pulling Harley deeper into financial and cultural decline. And as bad as the numbers were, dealers and riders began to fight back in their own way, launching a rebellion against the company's misguided direction. Voices from the dealerships. When Harley's own dealers turn against it, the crisis is undeniable. For decades, Harley's dealer network was the company's strongest asset, a group of people who lived and breathed the culture, often family-owned for generations. They weren't just middlemen, they were ambassadors, the bridge between factory decisions and rider loyalty. But under Jochen Seitz's leadership, even the dealers began to revolt. Matt Laidlaw, whose dealership in California has been a cornerstone for Harley enthusiasts, went public with scathing critiques. He accused the leadership of ignoring riders, chasing corporate image over substance, and pricing out the very people who built the brand. Bubba Boswell, another respected dealer, echoed the same frustration in interviews and podcasts. These weren't fringe voices. These were pillars of Harley's community calling out the company they loved. The criticisms weren't whispered behind closed doors. They were posted on YouTube, shared across rider forums, and amplified by the motorcycle press. The message was clear. Harley's leadership had lost touch with its frontline representatives. Dealers who had once proudly rallied behind new launches now openly distanced themselves from corporate decisions. This fracture was dangerous. When your dealers stop believing in your vision, they don't just complain, they stop selling. And when dealers stop selling, riders stop buying. The collapse was no longer confined to spreadsheets and boardrooms. It was spreading through the very veins of the Harley community. And while dealers raised their voices, riders themselves were facing a painful new reality. The cost of entry into the Harley world was climbing out of reach. The entry-level exodus, $12,000. Harley's new entry price slammed the door on a generation. For decades, Harley Davidson had built its reputation not just on premium touring bikes, but on accessible entry models. The Sportster line was often the first taste of Harley life for young riders. It was affordable, approachable, and iconic. When Zeitz's leadership axed these models, the damage went far beyond losing a product. It meant shutting out the pipeline of new enthusiasts who might have become lifelong customers. Suddenly, the cheapest Harley cost more than $12,000. For younger riders just starting out or for working-class families, that number was impossible. It was the equivalent of saying, "This culture isn't for you anymore." Instead of cultivating new generations, Harley created a wall of exclusivity. The company that once symbolized rebellion and accessibility now looked like a luxury brand for the wealthy. The result was predictable. Younger riders flocked to competitors. Japanese manufacturers like Honda and Yamaha offered stylish, reliable bikes for half the price. Even smaller brands found opportunities to capture the market Harley abandoned. Meanwhile, Harley's own community aged without replacement, creating a dangerous demographic cliff. The entry-level shutdown wasn't just a miscalculation, it was a betrayal. Riders who wanted to buy into the dream were told they weren't welcome unless they had deep pockets. And as this new wall rose higher, the underground Harley culture began to thrive. Fueled by bikes the company refused to sell. The Underground Harley. The bike Harley refused to sell became the people's favorite. While corporate leaders obsessed over futuristic dashboards and electric gimmicks, riders on the ground were embracing stripped-down machines that actually felt like Harley. One example was the Road King Police Edition. It was simple, rugged, and priced lower than the bloated touring models. Among enthusiasts, it gained a cult following. Riders loved its no-frills design and authenticity. But there was a catch. It was restricted to police use and never offered broadly to the public. Instead of recognizing the demand and seizing the moment, Harley killed it off. The decision baffled riders. Why would a company bleeding sales ignore clear grassroots enthusiasm? Why ignore a model that embodied everything people said they wanted? The answer was clear to many. Leadership no longer listened. Harley had become deaf to the streets that once defined it. This disconnect created an underground movement. Riders sought out discontinued models, restoring them, customizing them, and celebrating them at rallies. Social media lit up with photos of bikes Harley no longer made but riders still loved. It was as if the community itself was keeping the brand alive, while the company in Milwaukee seemed determined to bury it. But if the product decisions felt insulting, nothing compared to the rage sparked by executive paychecks. While riders struggled to keep the dream alive, Harley's top leadership cashed in like nothing was wrong. Million-dollar madness. The CEO who wrecked Harley got paid $12 million for the privilege. That was the annual compensation for Jochen Seitz while the company collapsed under his leadership. To make matters worse, in 2023, Harley's board handed him a bonus of $3 million. Even as sales tanked, dealerships struggled, and riders were priced out of entry-level models. The optics were outrageous. Riders who could no longer afford $12,000 entry bikes read headlines about a man responsible for the disaster pocketing $12 million. Dealers choking on unsold inventory watched as the CEO cashed checks larger than their entire annual revenue. The gap between corporate reward and community suffering had never been wider. For many, this wasn't just about money. It was about values. Harley was supposed to represent grit, authenticity, and loyalty. Instead, it began to look like another faceless corporation where failure was rewarded and loyalty punished. In online forums and at rallies, riders compared Zeitz's bonuses to salt rubbed into an open wound. It was one thing to lead poorly, it was another to profit from the wreckage. This corporate greed narrative spread quickly, giving riders a new rallying cry. They weren't just angry about lost bikes or rising prices, they were furious about injustice. The outrage over executive pay lit a fire in the community, making the backlash impossible to ignore. And while the Harley faithful were revolting, Wall Street was quietly delivering its own verdict, a financial collapse that looked like a death sentence for the brand. Wall Street's verdict, from $50 to $20. Harley's stock chart became a ski slope. For investors, the collapse wasn't just a financial event, it was a cultural shock. For decades, Harley Davidson had been viewed as a symbol of stability, an American icon whose name carried weight far beyond the balance sheet. Owning Harley stock was once a matter of pride, something you could mention at a barbecue with the same swagger as revving a bike on Main Street. But between 2023 and 2025, that pride turned to humiliation. In 2023, Harley stock traded at a healthy $50 per share. By the start of 2025, it had cratered to barely $20, a decline of more than 50%. And in one particularly brutal month, the stock shed 22% of its value, the kind of freefall normally reserved for companies facing bankruptcy scandals, not century-old institutions. Small investors who had held on through thick and thin, many of them loyal Harley riders themselves, saw their retirement savings vanish. Hedge funds pulled out quickly, but everyday shareholders felt the pain most. Analysts pointed to the obvious. Harley was bleeding revenue, alienating its core customers, and making baffling product decisions. Wall Street doesn't care about brand loyalty if the numbers don't add up. Nostalgia cannot hide a collapsing bottom line. Reports from major firms downgraded Harley from hold to sell, citing weak demand, mismanagement, and a shrinking market share. But the outrage wasn't just about numbers. Investors were furious about the disconnect between Harley's collapse and its executive paychecks. Watching Jochen Zeitz pocket $12 million while shareholders lost half their wealth felt like betrayal on a grand scale. It turned Harley from a safe bet into a cautionary tale, and as Wall Street turned away, Harley's collapse created an opening competitors wasted no time seizing. The thunder of those rivals was growing louder, and this time it was coming from Japan. The Japanese invasion reborn. While Harley stalled, Honda and Yamaha roared past. Japanese manufacturers had always been respected for their engineering, but now they were perfectly positioned to seize the opportunity Harley had abandoned. Harley's cheapest bikes began at $12,000 or more. Honda's Rebel series, by contrast, came in at half that price. Yamaha leaned into its mid-size cruisers, offering affordability and dependability, while Suzuki and Kawasaki chipped away at younger markets with sporty entry-level models. The effect was striking. Riders who once dismissed imports as cheap alternatives now embraced them without hesitation. In dealerships across the United States, Japanese bikes flew off the floor. Meanwhile, Harley showrooms felt like mausoleums, shiny but lifeless. Social media reflected the shift. Riders proudly posted photos of their new Hondas or Yamahas, captioning them with sarcastic comments about Harley's bloated prices and corporate failures. The mocking tone was clear. The torch of coolness had passed. This wasn't the first time Harley had faced such a crisis. In the 1980s, Japanese imports nearly killed the brand. Back then, Harley leaned into its Made in America identity and fought for tariffs that temporarily leveled the playing field. But this time was different. Harley had surrendered its authenticity by outsourcing production and chasing empty branding campaigns. It could no longer claim the moral high ground of American steel when factories in Thailand were producing its bikes. As Harley stumbled, its rivals moved not only to fill the gap, but to reshape the market entirely. Electric motorcycles, once Harley's supposed revolution, became the playground of Honda and Yamaha as they quietly prepared more affordable, functional models. The same technology Harley had botched with the Rewire might end up succeeding, but under a different badge. And while Japan's motorcycle giants surged, the consequences of Harley's decline spilled out of the marketplace and into something even more combustible: politics. And if you appreciate this kind of deep dive research, make sure to subscribe. We put in the hours to connect the dots behind stories like this so you can stay informed without doing all the digging yourself. Politics in the motorcycle vote. Harley riders once waved American flags, now they wave protest signs. For decades, Harley Davidson was political shorthand for patriotism and authenticity. Presidents, senators, and governors posed on Harleys, revving engines at rallies to tap into the symbolism of working-class America. But as Harley outsourced production, axed affordable bikes, and handed its CEO millions in bonuses during collapse, that symbolism soured. In states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, where Harley had been a proud employer for generations, outrage boiled over. Union leaders denounced the board's greed. Local politicians accused Harley of abandoning American workers. Rallies once filled with roaring engines now featured placards reading, "Save our jobs and bring Harley home." For blue-collar families who had built their lives around the company, the betrayal cut deep. The political fallout was immediate. Campaign strategists warned that Harley's collapse could influence elections. Swing states that once viewed the brand as a point of pride now treated it as proof of broken promises. For conservative politicians, once quick to associate themselves with Harley's image, the situation became a liability. Even commentators on right-leaning talk shows began questioning whether Harley's board had lost touch with the people it claimed to represent. Democrats seized the opportunity, framing Harley's outsourcing as another example of corporate greed hollowing out America. Republicans, divided over whether to defend or denounce the brand, struggled to hold their base. The controversy underscored a deeper divide about globalization, trade, and the future of American manufacturing. But beyond elections and political posturing, one question loomed larger than any campaign speech. If Harley Davidson, the most iconic motorcycle brand in the world, could collapse, what did that say about the future of American industry itself? The death of an icon? If Harley can collapse, what does that mean for American manufacturing? For over 100 years, Harley Davidson represented American grit. Its bikes were more than machines. They were emblems of freedom, rebellion, and working-class pride. Now, after years of mismanagement and betrayal, that symbol is disintegrating. Some analysts believe Harley will not survive as an independent company. Rumors of buyouts and foreign acquisitions have already surfaced. Others predict Harley will shrink into a niche luxury brand, producing overpriced machines for a shrinking group of wealthy enthusiasts. Few believe it can ever reclaim its dominance. The collapse has been too deep, the wounds too public. But Harley's downfall raises questions beyond motorcycles. What happens when other icons follow the same path? If Harley, once considered untouchable, can be hollowed out by bad leadership and outsourcing, what about Ford, General Motors, or the next American giant? Will future generations grow up buying only imports, their national identity tied to foreign brands? For riders, Harley's collapse feels deeply personal. It isn't just the loss of a company, it is the erosion of identity and community. Bike rallies that once celebrated pride now carry an undercurrent of anger. Forums that once shared road stories now debate whether Harley even deserves to exist. The brand's fate has become a mirror for the nation's anxieties about globalization, inequality, and the hollowing out of its middle class. And as engines roar in protest rides and riders gather to voice their fury, one truth grows undeniable. Harley's story has become bigger than motorcycles. It has become a warning about the soul of American manufacturing and whether that soul can survive in a world driven by profit over people. Harley's collapse isn't just a business story. It's a warning about what happens when companies forget the people who built them. If this breakdown gave you something to think about, hit like, drop a comment with your take, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next deep dive.